Beyond the Bony Labyrinths. Podcast on music and philosophy by Lodewijk Muns. Episode 8, Musical Quotation Marks 2, Schumann's Fantasie Opus 17. Quotation in music and musical quotation marks. This is the second time I want to talk about it. Quotation is a phenomenon that raises many questions and, precisely because of that, offers many perspectives. My starting point is again the interface between language and music. For music, quotation is one of the ways to come closer to language, to adopt some of its expressive possibilities. The more traditional view is that musical quotation is something quite different from linguistic quotation. I think this is a mistake that comes from too narrow a view of what quotation is. The model X said, quote, blah blah blah, unquote. Quotation is to be understood in a broader sense. One may quote in order to refer to a certain statement, something someone once said, but also a particular word, a particular expression, regardless of who used it, when the point is to draw attention to that expression itself, as an object from vocabulary or parlance. As when I refer to that last word, parlance, and wonder how it differs from idiom, and whether I should choose one or the other. Without that self-reference, the possibility to talk about words, language would not be the versatile instrument of communication that it actually is. We could make all kinds of observations, but we would not be able to communicate about that communication itself. We would not be able to translate. To ask what is the meaning of ascenseur presupposes that you are referring to that word as an element from another vocabulary, French. The words listed in a dictionary are, in fact, quoted words. Every quotation is an instance of borrowing from somewhere, but borrowing is not yet quoting. Borrowing is something we do all the time as speakers of a language. We borrow from other speakers and from the public domain of language itself. Every word we use is borrowed from the common vocabulary, what linguists call the lexicon. That lexicon of language includes not only single words, it is also full of patterns of words, expressions, idioms, clichés, schemas. We largely craft our sentences with prefabricated elements. When I look back at what I've just said and quote myself, there too I find word combinations, prefabricated elements, common vocabulary. We craft our sentences, common word combinations that I borrowed as a whole from the lexicon. The boundaries between such commonplace word combinations and quotation are not sharp. With other expressions, there is more between heaven and earth, pearls before the swine, breaking the ice. We can figure out where they come from, in this case, Shakespeare and the Bible. But someone who is using those expressions is not thereby quoting. The origin is usually irrelevant and mostly not even known to the speaker. The character of quotation has eroded over time. We borrow words and patterns of words from the common stock of language. Quotation is a special case of this, one in which that borrowing comes to attention. Similarly, most music is based on patterns borrowed from a kind of musical lexicon, a musical public domain. That includes not only scales and chords, the basic elements of music theory, but also chord sequences, tonal schemas, building blocks with which music was and is made. For instance, this chord sequence This is a simple alternation of two chords and no specific musical idea. We can slip in another chord, This too gives us nothing more than a basic schema which has been used countless times. No one has copyright on that. It is a piece of musical grammar. But it doesn't take much more. To arrive at the first prelude of Bach's wolhtemperierte Klavier, a recognizable, quotable piece of music. And with a slightly different elaboration, we get Mozart's Ave Verum. Or with the same schema in minor, Mozart's Symphony No. 40. Also in minor, this aria from Bach's Matthäuspassion. Which has more in common with its Sonata by Haydn in major than its chord sequence. The middle movement from Mozart's Piano Concerto K488, which I used in the first episode as the ultimate example of Mozartian beauty, also uses the same schema. In this case, the melodic progression, the phrasing, does not coincide with the schema. The melody overflows, as it were, and that is perhaps a factor in the strong expressive effect of this music. Mozart, Haydn, and Bach would not have argued over who owned copyright to that schema. It belongs to the stock of formulas that they and their contemporaries learned from a young age. They used them in improvisation, and thanks in part to that, they were able to compose almost at the same speed as they improvised. More time was lost in the physical labor of writing it down, with pen, ink, and paper. The line between such schemas and original invention is not sharp. The melodic phrases with which the harmonic schema is elaborated in these examples, too, can be stereotypical. As a result, there is often confusion as to whether a particular combination of notes is a quotation from some other composition or just a common pattern. A musical idea must be specific enough to count as individual invention and thus a quotable object. But how specific is specific enough? Let's look at an interesting dubious case. Robert Schumann's Fantasie in C major for piano is a moving and compelling piece, and one of the favorites in the romantic piano repertoire. The piece is called Fantasie, but it is actually a sonata in 3 movements, though in an unusual form. The first movement begins impetuously, passionately, fantastisch und leidenschaftlich. I reluctantly stop at this phrase, the phrase in question, because this episode would become far too long if I played the piece in its entirety. I've recorded a complete first and third movements as a supplementary recital in episode 9. This phrase is repeated with a certain emphasis at its first occurrence, like, watch out, this is significant. The phrase recurs several times in slightly different form, for instance, and later on, and finally, at the end of this movement, with extreme intimacy and intensity. That was a short excerpt. I'll let you hear the complete closing section later. It seems that this phrase, and then particularly as it sounds at the end of the movement, is a quotation from a work by another composer, from Beethoven's song cycle An die ferne Geliebte. There it is associated with the words Nimm sie hinden, diese Lieder, accept this offering of songs.
Nimm sie hinden, diese Lieder, die ich dir Geliebte sang.
This exceptional work by Beethoven needs a short explanation in turn. Beethoven's song cycle An die ferne Geliebte is a confusing work. It is alternately naive, subtly moving, and, in its operatic final climax, almost ridiculous. There are 6 songs, but are seamlessly connected. The text, by a little-known poet, Alois Jäteles, has a speaker whom we should imagine as a poet-singer. This first-person speaker finds himself far from his beloved. The songs are a kind of letter, and the poet-singer's intention is that his beloved will sing this musical poetic letter in turn after receiving it. If they both sing these songs, the sense of separation will disappear. For him, in the anticipation of the moment that she will sing them, and for her in the knowledge that his words and thoughts will come alive through her voice. It's an interesting variation on the DTPOT theme I discussed earlier, Darling, They're Playing Our Tune, a couple's favorite shared musical memory. Our tune is here deliberately created by the poet in the hope of a kind of DTPOT moment in the future. By singing the same song, the lovers can feel united across time and space. A kind of spiritual telecommunication, and perhaps even better than a phone call.
Denn vor Liedesklang entweichet jeder Raum und jede Zeit, und ein lieben Herz erreichet, was ein lieben Herz geweiht.
The melody Schumann is supposed to have quoted is a variant of this melody from the first song, as it appears in the last, 6th song. There it appears to be an allusion to, or perhaps a memory of that original melody, and in this new form we first hear it in the piano before the singer follows suit. In itself, it's plausible to assume that there is a link with Beethoven. At some point, Schumann had planned to contribute with his Fantasie to a Beethoven commemoration. A monument to the composer was to be erected in his hometown of Bonn. That eventually became the plump and grumpy colossus that still stands on the Münsterplatz. For a musical gift, a musikalisches Opfer, the allusion to that line of poetry, Nimm sie hinden, diese Lieder, would be quite appropriate. Still, there has been some debate over the question, is this really a quotation of that Beethoven phrase? When you hear one after the other, you might answer, of course. but on second hearing the similarity may be a bit too schematic, too unexceptional. What the two works have in common is an ordinary musical building block rather than an original idea, invention. Critics have pointed out that similar phrases can be found elsewhere, such as in Schubert's song Die Musik. The affinity there is harmonically stronger than in the case of Beethoven's phrase, which is based on a different common schema. This is the chord sequence with Schubert and Schumann, and this is Beethoven's. In fact, this harmonic skeleton is so ordinary that it is remarkable that Beethoven's phrase can still be so recognizable. Moreover, not everyone is convinced that the conclusion of Schumann's first movement even sounds like a quotation. There would be no quotation marks, something that makes it stand out as such. In the previous episode, I talked about musical quotation marks and what can serve as such. Musical quotation marks can be any means that marks a passage as an interruption in the flow of the event, similar to quotation marks in spoken language. A change of register, a small pause, emphasis, slowing down. According to Charles Rosen, renowned pianist, essayist and critic, that is precisely what is happening here, in the conclusion of the first movement of Schumann's Fantasie. The phrase is emphatically rendered at a slower tempo, and here at last is a resolution in the C major chord that has not yet been heard throughout the piece, and that is quite astonishing for a piece in the key of C major. I will now play the closing section in full. This conclusion sounds like a kind of epilogue, an afterthought on what we heard before from a different perspective. It is therefore clearly marked, and perhaps we can hear this as quotation marks. Rosen even argues that Schumann invented musical quotation marks with this passage. That is certainly incorrect. We find something similar already in the chansons of the 14th century. It was common to quote existing poetry in the chorus of a song, and that text quotation could then be marked musically by a slower tempo and change of texture. And that is also what seems to happen here in Schumann's Fantasie. Nothing new then. I doubt that there is a firm answer to the question, is Schumann quoting Beethoven? The historical connection with the Beethoven commemoration does make it somewhat more likely. But there is another biographical fact that makes it plausible. For Schumann himself, Clara Wieck was at this time his own distant beloved. In a letter to her, he characterized the first movement as eine tiefe Klage dich, a profound lamentation for you. The poetic idea behind Beethoven's cycle, the imaginary encounter through a shared musical experience, must have been dear to Schumann. This is clear from earlier correspondence between Robert and Clara, who were then not yet lovers. Robert, 23, writes to Clara, 13 years old, "Since there is no chain of electrical sparks that holds us together, I propose to use the power of sympathy. My idea is this. Tomorrow at 11 o'clock sharp, I will play the Adagio from Chopin's Variations and think of you intensely, only of you. Now I would like to ask you to do the same, so that we can meet in spirit." The DTPOT effect we recognized in die ferne Geliebte, in Schumann's fantasy takes the form of a kind of musical telepathy. In playing the same music at the same moment, they are spiritually united. The piece he mentions, Chopin's Adagio, comes from the fiendishly difficult variations on Mozart's La ci darem la mano, written by Chopin when he was 17 and a showpiece of the then 13-year-old Clara. That's the theme. Clara wrote in her diary that she had mastered the variations in 8 days. It would cost me a disproportionate portion of my life, but the Adagio I can manage. Schumann's proposal was, I suspect, meant to be jokingly ironic sentimental. This suits the whimsical nature of this variation and at the same time recalls Schumann's favorite authors, Jean-Paul and E.T.A. Hoffmann. Schumann had previously written a favorable review of the variations, and in it he interprets the turn to major at the end of the Adagio, just before the Polonaise, This moment he interprets as the first kiss of the lovers, that is, of Don Juan, Don Giovanni, and Zerlina in Mozart's opera. In doing so, did Schumann see himself in the role of Don Juan, Clara as Zerlina? Nowadays, such contact between an adult man and an adolescent girl would surely be considered very questionable. So, a Beethoven quote after all? It's hard to say. The fact that some listeners are reminded of Beethoven's distant beloved says nothing. It is only a quotation if we have to attribute to Schumann the intention of referring to those songs. It may also have been Schumann's unconscious memory. Even then, it is not a quotation, because quoting is something we do consciously. This uncertain conclusion may be unsatisfactory, but for me Schumann's Fantasie is interesting precisely as a doubtful case. We see here how musical schemas can create similarities that can sometimes be so striking that you no longer know whether a musical idea is borrowed from a specific work or from the musical public domain. And it is precisely in those vague borders that there is a similarity with language. While quotation is a very specific form of borrowing, that does not mean that quotation is always clearly pronounced. A passage or phrase can be vaguely quotation-like, and that adds to the richness of association through which music has meaning to us. According to Charles Rosen, the ending of that first movement of the Fantasie recalls not only Beethoven's phrase, but also all the previous times it appeared in the movement itself. And thus it sounds like a memory, an act of recall, a musical representation of the process of remembering. At the same time, the musical phrase is more crystallized here. It is no longer part of a longer phrase, but an independent thought, something that was anticipated before, but is only now rising to full consciousness. Now, in music, there is usually a lot of repetition, and every repetition of a musical motif or theme appeals to the listener's memory. Otherwise, we wouldn't recognize it as repetition. But usually, in doing so, there is no reason to speak of a quotation, to say that a repetition is a reference to that earlier occurrence within the piece, and let alone that it would represent the psychological process of remembering. That the alleged quotation can strike the listener as a spontaneous memory is most convincing where Schumann brings it up again. And then, quite unexpectedly, at the end of the slow third and last movement. The very fact that it appears here without preparation creates a discontinuity that makes it strongly marked, as something like quotation marks. But alas, Schumann deleted his passage before the work went to print. That Schumann had reservations about this quotation probably has to do precisely with this discontinuity. It goes against a kind of musical propriety which prescribes that music has structural coherence. An unexpected, singular quotation breaks that coherence. At the same time, though, it does suggest a kind of psychological coherence. Because it unambiguously recalls the conclusion of the first movement, we can ask, who is recalling that earlier moment? The composer, we might conveniently say, but then we are not talking about the historically real Robert Schumann, but rather about a character, a fictional alter ego, created by the composer in his music. A character who at the end of the fantasy is overwhelmed by the memory of that earlier experience, that feeling of Hingabe, of surrender. And to the extent that we make the music our own, identify with the musical self, that is also our feeling of surrender. It is an interesting question to what extent and under what circumstances you can discover in music a character, a psyche, a subjective I. It seems that Schumann himself felt that he put too much subjectivity into the music with this quotation. That Schumann deleted it is, according to Rosen, a regrettable decision, and I agree. In the final version, which can be heard in almost all recordings, the conclusion is disappointingly bland. In his plea for the original ending, Rosen, and I with him, goes against the consensus that declares the composer's last will to be law. Composers, like other people, often revise their previous judgments and revise their revisions when they have the opportunity. And life does not always provide enough opportunities. The last will may be legally uncontroversial. Aesthetically, it is a less rock-solid concept. This was episode 8 of Beyond the Bony Labyrinths. Episode 9 is a recital of the first and third movements of Schumann's Fantasie.